The hum of luxury engines purred beneath the polished floors of Novajet Airways Flight NJ762. Boarding was nearly complete, and in seat 3C of first class sat Elijah Brooks, a composed, sharply dressed black entrepreneur in his early 40s. He adjusted his cufflinks and opened his laptop, ready to prepare for a global tech summit in Geneva. That's when the tension began. "Excuse me, sir," a flight attendant interrupted, her voice pleasant but dripping with condescension. "We need you to move to accommodate one of our elite Sky Privilege passengers." Elijah looked up, confused. "I'm sorry?" "That seat is typically reserved for Mr. Landon Whitmore," she continued, gesturing behind her. Standing just a few steps away was a tall, silver-haired white man in an expensive tailored suit. His brows arched in disbelief, arms folded, impatience practically steaming off of him. "I always sit there," Whitmore declared loudly, ensuring nearby passengers could hear. "That seat is mine, has been for years." Elijah reached calmly into his coat pocket and retrieved his boarding pass. "This is my assigned seat, and I'm also a Novajet Elite member," he said, keeping his voice level. The flight attendant's smile wavered. "Yes, but some guests are more regular than others." Around them, murmurs began to spread like wildfire. A few passengers pulled out their phones. Elijah didn't flinch. He had faced bias before. But this was blatant. As the crew huddled near the galley, glancing back at him like he was the disturbance, not the victim, Elijah quietly opened his phone and hit record. What they didn't know was that the man they were trying to push aside wasn't just a passenger. He was the CEO of a major digital equity firm and their airline's potential investor. But right now, he was just a man being told, yet again, that he didn't belong. If you've ever been judged by how you look, not who you are, drop your story in the comments. And if you believe in fairness over favoritism, hit that subscribe button and type "stand" with your city. This story is just getting started. Long before Elijah Brooks ever set foot in a luxury first-class cabin, long before corporate press releases bore his name, and long before he was seen as the face of innovation in ethical tech, he was just a curious boy from the east side of Detroit, staring into the glow of a broken monitor in a cramped apartment. At 11, Elijah had never owned a brand new anything. His first computer was salvaged from a neighbor's garage, patched together with mismatched parts and more hope than hardware. While other kids played video games, Elijah was writing lines of code, crude at first, then increasingly sophisticated. He didn't know it then, but he was quietly crafting the foundation of a future that would one day challenge global corporations to be better. Life in his neighborhood wasn't easy. Gunshots were as common as car horns. At 16, Elijah lost his older brother, Malik, to a senseless act of violence, a shooting that rattled the entire block and shattered what little innocence Elijah had left. At the funeral, as he stood beside a casket far too small for someone so full of life, Elijah made a silent vow. He would rise. Not just for himself, but for every kid who'd ever been told their zip code defined their worth. That promise became his fire. Through community college, nights in diners doing freelance code work, and days hauling crates at a shipping dock to make rent, Elijah never stopped building. He coded through exhaustion. He pitched ideas to empty rooms. He was rejected more times than he could count. But every no was fuel. By the age of 29, Elijah founded EvoCore Systems, a tech firm focused on AI-driven fairness in customer experiences. What began as a side project bloomed into a $3.1 billion company with clients across 4 continents. Banks used his algorithms to reduce racial profiling in loan approvals. Hospitals used his platforms to track disparities in patient care. Even global retailers had begun licensing his systems to ensure their customer support didn't favor certain accents or zip codes. And yet, despite everything he had built, despite the awards, keynote speeches, and partnerships with Fortune 100 giants, there were still moments when he walked into a room and was mistaken for an assistant, or worse, a threat. That morning at Orion International Airport, Elijah had helped an elderly man navigate the new biometric gates, holding his luggage and guiding him with patience. He thanked every staff member he interacted with by name, not because cameras were rolling, but because it was who he was. He chose Novajet Airways not for its exclusivity, but for its promise of seamless professionalism. He had an important keynote to deliver at the Global Ethics and Innovation Conference in Geneva, a stage where world leaders and tech giants listened when he spoke. He'd specifically selected seat 3C for its legroom so he could refine his speech mid-flight. He never imagined the biggest lesson in ethics that day wouldn't come from his keynote, but from what unfolded before takeoff. As he sat calmly in that leather seat, the murmurs around him grew. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the disbelief that a black man, alone, quiet, confident, could belong in that seat. The assumptions hung heavy in the air like turbulence before a storm. But Elijah had weathered storms before. He hadn't built EvoCore just to sit in boardrooms. He built it so that one day, kids like him wouldn't have to justify their presence. So that one day, nobody would be asked to move from a seat they'd earned. And on that flight, even as pressure mounted, eyes narrowed and voices turned sharp, Elijah Brooks didn't move, because what he represented was bigger than a seat. He was a reminder that dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. The hum of engines faded beneath the tension that was rapidly filling the first-class cabin of Novajet Flight NJ762. Elijah Brooks remained seated in 3C, calm but focused, as the situation around him escalated from subtle disapproval to something far more hostile and public. Across the aisle, Landon Whitmore still hadn't taken his eyes off Elijah. "I always sit there," he repeated, this time louder, theatrically checking his platinum wristwatch. "This is absurd. I have meetings in Zurich that won't wait." The flight attendant, Amelia, stood uneasily at Elijah's side. Her polished smile was slipping. "Sir," she said again, softer but firmer, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a different seat. There's an open one in row 5, still business class." Elijah glanced up from his tablet, voice even and controlled. "This is my assigned seat. I chose it specifically because of the extra legroom. I'll be staying here." There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough for the surrounding passengers to start pulling out their phones, sensing that something unusual, possibly viral, was unfolding before them. One woman angled her screen just enough to begin recording discreetly. Landon muttered loudly enough for nearby rows to hear, "Doesn't even look like someone who flies first class." Then came the moment that shifted the tone from awkward to dangerous. As Landon appeared to adjust his briefcase, he subtly slipped something into Amelia's palm, a folded stack of cash. "Handle it," he said under his breath, the words soft but unmistakably clear. Amelia's face paled. Her eyes flicked between the money and the man who sat calmly, defiantly in 3C. She turned toward the front of the cabin. Minutes later, a new figure appeared, tall, stiff-backed, authoritative. It was Trevor Hale, the cabin supervisor, and he wasted no time asserting his role. "Sir," he announced loudly, "you are being asked to move to accommodate one of our most valued Sky Privilege members." "I've already shown my boarding pass," Elijah replied. "I have Sky Privilege status as well. This is my assigned seat." Trevor leaned in, dropping his voice to a tone usually reserved for children being scolded. "Perhaps you're unfamiliar with how things work here. We cater to guests with expectations, specific ones." The condescension was sharp, cutting through any illusion of neutrality. Elijah met Trevor's gaze without blinking. "What I'm unfamiliar with," he said evenly, "is being asked to give up a paid seat so someone else can be more comfortable." Landon huffed in the aisle, arms crossed theatrically. "This is ridiculous. I'll be reporting this to your corporate office. I spend 6 figures with this airline annually." Trevor took a half step closer. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Still, Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not moving." It was 6 words: calm, steady, and devastating. And just like that, the control Trevor thought he had began to slip. He stormed to the front, lifted the crew phone, and called the captain. Within minutes, Captain Jenna Reeves emerged from the cockpit, her expression professional, but clearly burdened. "What's the issue?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. Trevor and Amelia spoke over each other, painting a narrative of disruption and uncooperativeness. Elijah remained silent until the captain turned to him. "I've done nothing wrong," he said. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I've shown proof of status. I've refused to move because another passenger feels entitled to my seat. If there's a policy that overrides that, I'd love to see it." Captain Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "We do reserve the right to reassign seats as needed. But based on what criteria?" Elijah pressed. "Whose comfort? Whose preferences?" The moment was electric. Phones continued recording. The tension was no longer just between Elijah and the staff. The whole cabin was involved now. Then Elijah reached into his coat pocket and slowly turned on his phone's camera. "I'm documenting this," he said, "for my own protection." Trevor's eyes flared. "Recording is not permitted." "Actually," Elijah replied, "as long as I'm not interfering with crew operations, I have every right to film." A long, chilling silence followed, and then came the footsteps. 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded the aircraft. What had begun as a simple seat dispute had become a moment of truth, not just for Elijah, but for the airline, its crew, and everyone watching, both on the plane and, soon, around the world. The moment Elijah Brooks stepped off Novajet flight NJ762 escorted by 2 uneasy airport security officers, the air outside felt heavier than it should have. Not because of humiliation. Elijah had endured that before. It was something else, something colder, sharper. A reckoning had just been set in motion. He didn't speak to the guards, didn't argue. He simply straightened his blazer, pulled out his phone, and typed a single message. "Elise, I've been removed. Time to move." Within minutes, the quiet hum of the private terminal shifted into rapid motion. Elise Monroe, COO of EvoCore Systems, Elijah's longtime second-in-command, was already rerouting her flight to meet him. Their legal counsel and communications director were on standby. Laptops opened, phones lit up. Something big was unfolding, and the world was about to see it. What no one on that plane had known, what Novajet's staff had never bothered to check, was that Elijah wasn't just another first-class passenger. He was their biggest silent partner. For the last 18 months, EvoCore Systems had been acquiring shares in Novajet Aviation Holdings. Quietly, strategically. At the time of boarding, Elijah Brooks owned 23.7% of the airline. A stake that, when combined with strategic partners, gave him controlling interest. And now they had forcibly removed him from his own investment. As Elijah sat in the lounge waiting for Elise, a young woman approached. She looked nervous but determined. "I was sitting across from you," she said, clutching her phone. "I recorded everything. From the first moment they asked you to move to, well, all of it, and I think you should have this." She handed Elijah her phone. The footage was crisp, unbroken. It caught every microaggression, every word, every exchanged glance. Most damning of all, it captured the moment Landon Whitmore slipped cash into Amelia's hand, and the whispered thanks to the supervisor after Elijah was escorted off. "Thank you," Elijah said softly, his voice carrying the weight of grace and quiet resolve. "This will help." Within an hour, the video had been uploaded. Within 6, it had gone viral. Hashtag Novajet discrimination was trending in 5 countries. News anchors debated it, celebrities weighed in. Civil rights lawyers called it the textbook example of modern bias in corporate practice. Every frame of the recording screamed one undeniable truth. Elijah Brooks was targeted not for what he did, but for who he was. Back at Novajet headquarters, panic began to spread. In the sleek corner office of CEO Ronald Crane, the PR director's voice shook as she played the footage on loop. "This isn't a typical incident," she whispered. "This is going to sink us." Crane waved her off at first. "Passengers get upset. We issue apologies. This will pass." But when the manifest's name was confirmed and the PR assistant said, "Sir, the man in the video is Elijah Brooks," the room froze. Crane dropped into his chair. "The Elijah Brooks? EvoCore?" The PR director nodded. "Yes, and we've just forcibly removed him from a flight. He owns 23.7% of our company." The fallout was instant. Stock price dropped 11% in a single morning. Emails from investors flooded in. Lawyers began drafting letters, not to defend the airline, but to distance themselves from it. Later that afternoon, Elijah's assistant connected a direct call with the Novajet executive board. On the speaker, his voice was measured but resolute. "I want to call an emergency shareholders meeting. Today. This isn't just a PR crisis, it's a cultural one. And as your largest stakeholder, I have decisions to make." Board members, still unaware of who they had offended, soon found themselves in the presence of the very man whose dignity they had attempted to erase. Elijah entered the boardroom without fanfare. Same suit, same calm demeanor. But everything had changed. He wasn't just the man they removed. He was the man who now held their survival in his hands. Trevor Hale sat in silence, his back stiff against the cold metal chair in Conference Room B of Novajet's corporate headquarters. Beside him, Amelia, the flight attendant, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling in her lap. Captain Grant Davis, once considered one of the most experienced pilots in the company's fleet, stared blankly at the floor, as if the past 24 hours had added 20 years to his weathered face. The room was sterile, devoid of sympathy. And for the first time in their careers, the people used to giving orders were now waiting for judgment. The door opened. In stepped the director of human resources, flanked by 2 company attorneys and a pair of uniformed security officers. Their presence was the first sign this was no ordinary disciplinary meeting. "I'll be direct," the HR director said, placing 3 sealed envelopes on the table. "Your employment with Novajet Airlines is terminated, effective immediately." Amelia let out a sharp gasp. Trevor's mouth opened in protest, but no words came. Captain Davis simply exhaled slowly, as if he'd been expecting this since the video surfaced. "We were following procedure," Trevor finally choked out. "That passenger was uncooperative. He disrupted the boarding process." The HR director calmly turned her laptop around and hit play. The video, the same one now viewed by over 12 million people, began to roll. Trevor's voice, dismissive, condescending. Amelia's discomfort, visible yet silent. Captain Davis's passivity, complete. And then, the money. Karen Whitmore slipping folded bills into Trevor's pocket. "I appreciate you handling that situation," she whispered, unaware that multiple passengers were still recording. "First class should have standards." The clip ended. The room was silent. "Was that procedure?" the HR director asked, her tone razor sharp. Amelia broke first. Her voice cracked. "We made a terrible mistake," she said through tears. "I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop it." Trevor, usually the loudest in any room, stared at the table. His defiance had drained, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man watching everything crumble. Captain Davis spoke last, soft, broken. "I trusted their judgment," he said, nodding toward his former crew, "but I didn't ask the right questions. That's on me." The HR director nodded. "Not only did you violate our company's code of ethics, but you endangered its future. That passenger was Elijah Brooks, CEO of EvaCore Systems and our largest shareholder." The words hit them like a second impact. Trevor's face paled. Amelia whispered, "Oh my God." Captain Davis didn't move. "You'll be escorted to collect your belongings," the HR director concluded. "Your final pay will include 2 weeks severance. Given the circumstances, that is generous. Generous." As they were let out, other employees watched from their desks, some wide-eyed, others whispering. The same walk Elijah Brooks had taken hours earlier, quiet, humiliating, with dozens of eyes tracking each step, was now theirs to endure. But the consequences didn't stop at the company doors. Trevor spent the next 2 weeks firing off applications to every major airline in the region. None replied. When one recruiter finally did call him back, the tone shifted abruptly halfway through. "Wait. Are you the supervisor from the Novajet video?" Click. Amelia faced similar rejection. Her once polished LinkedIn now attracted a different kind of attention. Comments ranging from, "Shame on you," to, "I hope you never fly again." She deleted every social app from her phone, but it didn't stop the world from remembering. Captain Davis, with 3 decades in the cockpit, realized his career had ended in those few silent minutes when he stood by and did nothing. And as for Karen Whitmore, the passenger who believed her money could buy anything, the fallout came fast and public. Novajet issued a lifetime ban. Her company placed her on indefinite leave. Her name trended for days as Airline Karen, with commentaries dissecting her entitlement and racial bias. Once admired for her luxury lifestyle, she now found herself alone in a living room filled with silence and consequences. For all of them, the price wasn't just the loss of income, it was reputation, legacy, and the slow, creeping realization that in an age of accountability, the cameras don't blink. And dignity? It can't be bought or bullied away. 2 days after the video shattered Novajet's public image, the airline's towering glass headquarters resembled a war room more than a corporate office. Sleepless executives, publicists, and attorneys moved like ghosts between meeting rooms, their conversations hushed but urgent. At the center of it all stood Elijah Brooks. He wasn't there for vengeance. He was there for transformation. Novajet had invited him back, not just as an investor or partner, but as the man who now defined the fork in their company's future. He didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He simply handed CEO Ronald Crane a folder and waited. Inside was a full restructuring blueprint, a comprehensive plan for corporate cultural reform drawn from years of EvoCore's data on systemic bias in customer experience. Crane looked up, stunned. "You were preparing this already?" Elijah nodded. "We were evaluating your company long before you evaluated me." Hours later, the announcement came. All flights, all services, every route, suspended. For 48 hours, Novajet grounded its entire fleet, the first full halt in its 30-year history that wasn't weather or war-related. It was for something bigger: introspection. Across terminals, passengers stood stunned as screens flashed a single message. "This flight is temporarily grounded for something more important than takeoff. We're learning how to serve you better." In boardrooms turned classrooms, every employee, from ticketing agents to senior vice presidents, was required to complete immersive, intensive training on bias awareness and ethical service. This wasn't checkbox corporate compliance. It was confronting. EvoCore's training modules included AI-driven simulations, role-play of real passenger interactions, and group discussions led by behavioral psychologists. Employees were required to watch the video, all of it, to listen to the tone, see the body language, feel the silence, and then Elijah entered. He didn't speak from a pedestal. He stood on the floor, level with everyone else. "What happened to me," he began, "happens to people every single day. The only difference is that most of them don't have a camera, a company, or a platform, and that should bother you." Some employees averted their eyes, others nodded, a few cried. "This isn't about me being your largest investor," he continued. "It would have been just as wrong if I were a teacher, a nurse, a student flying home." The room was still. He had their full attention. Crane followed with the company's official commitment. "From today, Novajet will implement zero-tolerance policies for discrimination of any form. We will protect employees who speak up, and we will rebuild our culture, not just for compliance, but for conscience." The airline launched a partnership with EvoCore to permanently embed ethical behavior systems into every department. Complaint tracking algorithms were updated to flag patterns. Employees were empowered to report injustices without fear of retaliation. The old customer privilege hierarchy, where regular spenders got silent allowances, was disbanded. Passengers noticed the change almost immediately. "I had an issue with my seat," one traveler posted on social media, "and for the first time, they didn't size me up before solving it." A mother traveling with her son noted, "The crew actually knelt down to speak to my child, treated him like a human being. That never used to happen." Customer satisfaction scores across all demographics surged. For the first time in Novajet's history, Black, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern passengers reported equal or better service than their white counterparts, a statistic that had once seemed impossible. And Elijah. He didn't demand statues or headlines, but he did sit in on every major policy meeting for the next 3 months, not as an outsider demanding accountability, but as a collaborator shaping something new. Because transformation isn't about punishment, it's about purpose. And having the courage to admit that who you are today isn't who you have to remain tomorrow. 6 months had passed since the scandal that nearly brought Novajet to its knees. The airline, once mocked for its bias and arrogance, was now being praised for something rare in the corporate world: authentic change. But for the people at the center of that storm, Trevor Hale, Amelia Ross, and Captain Grant Davis, life had not simply moved on. For them, the video wasn't just viral history. It was personal shame, played on loop. Trevor sat in a modest apartment surrounded by rejection emails. "We've chosen to go in a different direction. Thank you for your interest, but we will not be moving forward." Even airlines desperate for staffing shortages wouldn't touch his name. To most, he was no longer a supervisor. He was that guy from the video. Amelia found herself in a similar spiral. Former friends stopped returning her messages. Her once thriving social life had vanished into silence. Every interview ended the same way, with polite small talk until recognition set in. Captain Davis, with over 30 years of flight experience, now spent most of his time sitting in silence, wondering how decades of service could be eclipsed by a single moment of moral cowardice. Then came an email, subject the Second Chance program, from the Brooks Foundation. Elijah Brooks hadn't forgotten them. He had launched a new initiative through his foundation, not to punish, but to rebuild. The Second Chance program was designed for individuals who had lost their jobs due to bias-related incidents, offering rigorous training, psychological support, and, if completed, a pathway back into the workforce. But the process wasn't easy. Trevor entered the program defensive, frustrated. "I'm not a bad person," he declared in his first group session. "I didn't use slurs. I didn't." A facilitator interrupted gently. "Bias isn't always loud. Mr. Vaza Hale. Sometimes it whispers through assumptions." Over time, Trevor began to see the patterns. He talked about growing up in a household where jokes about those people were normal, where success had always looked like one type of person, where no one ever challenged him until Elijah Brooks. "I thought I was one of the good ones," he admitted weeks later, voice cracking. "But I never questioned who I gave the benefit of the doubt to and who I didn't." Amelia's journey focused on moral courage, the kind that requires speaking up even when it costs you. "I knew it was wrong," she confessed in a reflection exercise. "When Landon slipped Trevor the money, when Elijah was treated like a problem, I saw it, and I said nothing." Her voice shook. "I wanted to keep my job, now I don't have one. But worse, I didn't keep my integrity either." Captain Davis's transformation was perhaps the most painful. He had prided himself on neutrality, on not getting involved. But the program forced him to confront the consequences of silence. "I trusted the wrong people," he reflected. "I thought professionalism meant staying out of conflict. But neutrality in the face of injustice is complicity." After 3 months of daily training, simulations, and accountability sessions, the trio stood before a small audience of program mentors, graduates, and observers. They weren't the same people who had stood in that conference room at NovaJet, full of excuses and entitlement. They were quieter, humbled, aware. Each received a certificate of completion, not as an absolution, but as a sign of work done and work still ahead. Trevor applied for a baggage handling position at a regional airline. He included the full story in his application. He was hired, not because they forgot who he was, but because they saw who he was trying to become. Amelia was next. She started on the ground crew, loading meals and refueling carts in freezing early morning hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it was hers to earn. Captain Davis knew he would never fly commercially again, but he found something new: purpose. He began teaching within the Second Chance program, guiding others through the same transformation that saved his own humanity. And Elijah? He never asked them to say thank you, because the real justice wasn't in making them pay. It was in helping them change. 6 months after Elijah Brooks was escorted off a plane he rightfully boarded, NovaJet Airlines wasn't just surviving, it was leading. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. Employee satisfaction had soared to its highest in the company's history. Passenger complaints had plummeted. And most telling of all, service quality ratings, especially from Black, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern passengers, had not only improved, but now exceeded industry standards. But the numbers only told part of the story. In a quiet boardroom lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, Elijah sat across from NovaJet CEO Ronald Crane. Between them lay a folder, the 6-month progress report compiled by independent auditors. "You've shown real change," Elijah said, closing the folder. "That deserves recognition." Crane exhaled, the fatigue in his eyes softening into something closer to gratitude. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted, "but it's been necessary. What happened that day forced us to see what we had ignored for years." Elijah nodded. "That's how real change happens, not through comfort, but through confrontation." They shook hands, not as adversaries and not quite as friends, but as partners in transformation. And yet, the most powerful chapter was still to come. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Elijah stood at the podium of a packed press conference. Cameras clicked, reporters waited, but his tone was calm, almost intimate. Accountability, he said, doesn't always mean permanent punishment. He introduced the Second Chance Initiative as a permanent program under the Brooks Foundation, aimed at helping individuals who had lost careers due to bias-related incidents earn their way back through education, growth, and truth. Because justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about progress. In the audience sat Trevor Hale, Amelia Ross, and Captain Grant Davis, not hidden, not ashamed, but present. They had completed their journeys through the program and now stood as living proof that redemption is possible, if one is willing to do the work. Trevor had recently started mentoring new ground crew hires on professionalism and respect. Amelia had earned a promotion to crew training coordinator at a regional airline, and Captain Davis was now teaching aviation ethics to cadets, using his failure as a lesson, not a wound. But the change wasn't just inside Novajet. Other airlines began to take note. Several carriers reached out to EvoCorps, seeking similar cultural diagnostics and training partnerships. Airports updated their employee codes of conduct. Industry media dubbed it the Brooks Standard, a new benchmark for equity in the skies. And for Elijah, that was the real victory. Not revenge, not headlines, but proof that dignity, when defended with courage, could ripple through systems once thought untouchable. In his final remarks that day, Elijah looked not at the cameras, but at the young people watching from behind their screens, the ones who had messaged him, written letters, whispered thank you in terminals. If you've ever been told you don't belong in a space you've earned, hear this. You do. If you've ever been asked to shrink, to step aside, to be silent for someone else's comfort, don't. Stand tall, speak clearly, and know that the world is beginning to change because of people like you. As applause echoed through the hall, a quiet peace settled over him. What had started as humiliation at 30,000 feet had become something much greater, a movement that didn't just demand justice. It delivered it with dignity, with grace, and with a first-class vision for a more equal world.